Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Edward Bradford Titchener, the architect of mental elements. Together and apart, they mapped the territories of inner experience from opposing shores, one diving into mythic depths, the other ascending towards structural clarity. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of consciousness, one seeing symbolic images emerging from ancestral depths, the other discovering elementary sensations arranged in precise patterns. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Titchener as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the closing years of the 19th century, when psychology was still finding its footing as a science distinct from philosophy and physiology, two young men stood at different edges of the emerging discipline, each gazing inward but seeing entirely different landscapes. One stood in the neat corridors of a laboratory at Cornell University in upstate New York, surrounded by instruments designed to measure the precise qualities of sensation. The other walked the shadowed halls of the Bergholzli Mental Hospital in Zurich, listening to the fragmented utterances of patients whose minds had slipped beyond the boundaries of rational discourse. Neither yet knew the full shape of the vision that would define his life's work, but already their orientations diverged like two rivers flowing from the same mountain toward opposite seas. Edward Bradford Titchener arrived at Cornell in 1892, a young Englishman carrying with him the rigorous training he had received in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory at Leipzig. He was 25 years old, brilliant, autocratic in temperament, and possessed of an almost religious conviction that psychology could and must become a natural science as exact as physics or chemistry. The America to which he came was pragmatic, restless, hungry for useful knowledge, but Titchener brought with him something different, something that would seem almost monastic in its dedication to pure understanding, divorced from practical application. He sought not to improve the human condition or to heal broken minds, but to map consciousness itself in all its elemental simplicity. The laboratory he established at Cornell became a temple to this vision. Its rooms were carefully controlled environments where stimuli could be presented with precision and subjects trained to observe their own mental processes with disciplined attention. Light of measured intensity, sounds of calibrated frequency, weights and pressures applied with exactitude, tastes and smells presented in isolation from context. Everything was designed to strip away the accidental, the personal, the meaningful, to reveal beneath the chaos of everyday experience the basic building blocks of mental life. Titchener believed that consciousness, like matter, could be analyzed into its fundamental elements, and that these elements combined according to discoverable laws to create the rich tapestry of human awareness. His subjects were not patients seeking healing, but trained observers, often his own graduate students, who learned through long practice to report not what objects they perceived, but what sensations composed their perceptions. When shown an apple, they were to describe not an apple, but the specific patches of red and green, the particular gloss of light on curved surface, perhaps a faint sweet smell, the tactile imagination of smooth, cool skin. This was introspection, but introspection of a particular kind, disciplined and systematic, aimed at penetrating through the meaningful world we inhabit to the sensory elements from which meaning is constructed. There was, in Titchener's approach, something almost ascetic, a stripping away that sought purity through reduction. He distrusted the untrained mind's tendency to leap immediately to meaning, to see wholes rather than parts, to interpret rather than simply observe. He called this error the stimulus error, this mistake of confusing the object perceived with the sensations of perception itself. His entire methodological apparatus was designed to train observers beyond this natural tendency, to make them aware of the raw material of consciousness before it was woven into the fabric of meaningful experience. By the time Carl Gustav Jung arrived at the Berg-Hillsley Hospital in 1900, Titchener had been refining his structuralist psychology for nearly a decade. Jung was 25, the same age Titchener had been when he came to Cornell, but where Titchener had arrived in America with a clear methodological vision inherited from Wundt, Jung arrived at the Berg-Hillsley uncertain, seeking, pulled by contradictory intellectual currents. He had studied medicine at Basel, had been fascinated by both the empirical rigor of science and the philosophical questions that science seemed unable to answer. He had chosen psychiatry partly because it seemed to occupy a borderland between body and soul, between measurable symptoms and immeasurable suffering. The Berg-Hillsley was one of the leading psychiatric institutions in Europe, directed by Eugen Bleuler, a humane and innovative clinician who believed that even the most disturbed patients could be understood and helped if one listened carefully enough to their seemingly senseless utterances. Here Jung encountered minds that had broken in ways that laboratory psychology could scarcely imagine. Patients who believed they were God or Napoleon, who heard voices commanding them to sacred missions, who wove elaborate delusional systems from fragments of religious mythology and personal history. Their consciousness did not present itself as a neat arrangement of sensations and feelings, but as a chaos of images, symbols, voices, visions, all charged with intense personal meaning that often exceeded any rational explanation. Jung's earliest research involved word association tests, a method that seemed superficially similar to Titchener's experimental approach. Present a stimulus word, measure the time it takes for the subject to respond with an associated word, note any unusual delays or responses. It was precise, quantifiable, seemingly objective. But what Jung discovered through these tests was something that would have disturbed Titchener's orderly universe. He found that certain words provoked delays, emotional reactions, strange associations that pointed to hidden complexes of feeling and memory. The stimulus did not simply produce a predictable response according to the laws of association. Rather, it sometimes struck something deep and personal, a wound or a wish, sending ripples through the entire psyche. Where Titchener was stripping away meaning to find elementary sensations, Jung was following meaning into hidden depths. The same word might produce entirely different associations in different people, or even in the same person at different times, depending on what lay beneath the surface of conscious awareness. There was, Jung began to suspect, another region of mind, not merely unconscious in the sense of temporarily unattended or forgotten, but actively unconscious, a realm of psychic contents that influence behavior and experience without ever appearing directly in awareness. This was the beginning of Jung's long journey into what he would later call the collective unconscious. But in those early years at the Berg Halsey, he was still working within the framework of experimental psychology and psychiatry. He read widely in the emerging literature of the new science, including the structural psychology being developed by Wundt and his students. It is almost certain that Jung encountered Titchener's work, at least indirectly, through the German and Swiss journals that reported on developments in American psychology. But if Jung read Titchener, he left little record of what he thought. Perhaps Titchener's meticulous analysis of sensations seemed too remote from the compelling dramas unfolding in the hospital wards. Perhaps the controlled laboratory seemed a sterile place compared to the fertile chaos of the psychotic imagination. For his part, Titchener would have had little use for Jung's explorations. Throughout his career, Titchener maintained strict boundaries around what he considered legitimate psychological science. He distinguished sharply between psychology proper, which was the study of conscious experience in its elemental structure, and all the neighboring fields that dealt with practical applications or speculative theories. He had no interest in abnormal psychology, regarding it as a branch of medicine rather than pure science. He had even less interest in psychoanalysis when it began to arrive from Vienna in the early 1900s. The unconscious, as conceived by Freud and later Jung, seemed to Titchener not a scientific concept, but a metaphysical speculation, not open to direct observation and therefore not amenable to genuine psychological investigation. There is a profound irony here, for both men claim to practice introspection, to base their understanding of mind on the careful observation of inner experience. But the introspection they practiced could hardly have been more different. Titchener's introspection was trained, controlled, deliberate, focused on the present moment of sensation. It sought to hold consciousness still, as it were, to examine its contents as one might examine specimens under a microscope. The observer was to remain detached, objective, reporting sensations without interpretation or elaboration. Jung's method, which he would later call active imagination, moved in exactly the opposite direction. Rather than holding consciousness still to examine its elements, Jung encouraged consciousness to move, to follow images wherever they led, to engage with symbolic contents that arose spontaneously from the unconscious. His observers were not trained to be objective, but encouraged to be participatory, to enter into dialogue with the figures and symbols that emerged, to allow meaning to unfold rather than to strip meaning away. Where Titchener sought purity through reduction, Jung sought wholeness through amplification. The cultural contexts that shaped these two men were as different as their methods. Titchener came from Victorian England, had been educated at Oxford in classics before turning to psychology. He carried with him a certain aristocratic bearing, a belief in rigorous intellectual discipline and hierarchy. His laboratory at Cornell was run with almost military precision. Students addressed him formally, followed strict protocols, understood themselves to be apprentices learning a craft from a master. There was, in Titchener's world, a sense of order, of clear boundaries and proper procedures that reflected both his personality and the broader Victorian ideal of scientific progress through disciplined investigation. Jung grew up in a very different Switzerland, a land of mountains and deep lakes, where folklore and Christianity intermingled in rural communities, where the rational surface of modern life seemed thin and beneath it lay older, stranger currents. His father was a Protestant pastor, troubled by doubts, and Jung's childhood was marked by uncanny experiences, vivid dreams, an early awareness that the inner world was as real and often more compelling than the outer. He grew up reading Goethe and Nietzsche as well as scientific texts, absorbing a romantic tradition that valued imagination and intuition alongside reason. These personal and cultural differences expressed themselves in how each man understood the purpose of psychology itself. For Titchener, psychology was a pure science, aimed at understanding consciousness for its own sake, without regard for practical application or therapeutic benefit. He explicitly rejected the growing movement toward applied psychology, toward mental testing and industrial efficiency and clinical intervention. Science, he believed, must be disinterested, must seek knowledge without asking how that knowledge might be used. There was something almost noble in this stance, but also something increasingly isolated. As American psychology moved rapidly toward pragmatism and application in the early 20th century, Titchener remained in his laboratory at Cornell, refining his methods, training his students, defending the purity of structural analysis against what he saw as the contaminations of functionalism and behaviorism. Jung, by contrast, came to psychology through medicine, through the immediate need to understand and help suffering patients. While he was deeply interested in theoretical questions, in understanding the nature and structure of the psyche, he never lost sight of the therapeutic dimension. His psychology was always in service to healing, to helping individuals achieve greater wholeness and self-realization. This did not make him less rigorous or less scientific in his own estimation, but it meant that his science was always embedded in human purposes, always responsive to the demands of actual people struggling with actual difficulties. As the first decade of the 20th century unfolded, both men were developing the mature forms of their psychological visions, but they were moving in divergent directions. Titchener was elaborating his structural psychology, publishing his massive textbook, and training a generation of students in introspective method. His system became increasingly comprehensive and increasingly isolated. He mapped consciousness into three basic elements: sensations, images, and feelings. Each could be analyzed according to various attributes. Sensations had quality, intensity, duration, clearness. Images were weaker copies of sensations. Feelings varied along three dimensions: pleasantness, unpleasantness, tension, relaxation, excitement, depression. All the richness of mental life, he argued, could be understood as combinations of these elementary processes occurring according to laws of association. Jung, during these same years, was moving in a different direction entirely. His work with word association tests had led him to Freud, and in 1907 the two men met and talked for 13 hours straight, initiating one of the most famous and ultimately most painful relationships in the history of psychology. For several years, Jung was Freud's heir apparent, his most brilliant and valued colleague. But even during their collaboration, Jung was troubled by Freud's insistence on reducing all psychological phenomena to sexuality. Jung's patients, especially his later patients from the educated middle class, seemed to be suffering from something else, a spiritual emptiness, a loss of meaning. Their symptoms expressed not merely repressed sexual wishes, but existential questions, religious longings, the need to find purpose and pattern in their lives. The break with Freud, when it came in 1913, plunged Jung into a period of intense inner turmoil that he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years, he deliberately cultivated states of imagination in which figures and scenes arose spontaneously from some unknown depth. He recorded these experiences in what would become the Red Book, a remarkable document that is part diary, part artwork, part philosophical dialogue. Here, Jung engaged with personified aspects of his own psyche, with archetypal figures that seemed to carry knowledge beyond his conscious understanding. The experience was at times terrifying, at times exalting, but it convinced him absolutely that the unconscious was not merely a repository of repressed personal memories, but a creative source, a realm of transpersonal images and patterns that connected individual consciousness to something much older and larger. Imagine if Titchener could have witnessed Jung's active imagination sessions, could have observed Jung in dialogue with the archetypal figures that arose from his unconscious depths. What would the master of controlled introspection have made of this wild, undisciplined exploration? Almost certainly he would have dismissed it as unscientific, as a confusion of imagination with observation, as precisely the kind of subjective wandering that rigorous method was designed to exclude. For Titchener, the observer must remain detached, must report sensations without allowing fantasy or interpretation to corrupt the purity of observation. Jung's method violated every principle of Titchener's structural psychology, and yet, from another perspective, one might argue that Jung was taking introspection to places Titchener had never imagined, was exploring regions of inner experience that Titchener's method could not reach. Titchener observed only the conscious, present moment, the sensations and images and feelings currently in awareness. Jung was observing something else, the spontaneous productivity of the unconscious, the way psyche generates meaning and symbol. When consciousness loosens its grip and allows deeper processes to manifest, both men claimed to be observing inner experience, but they were observing different layers, different dimensions of that experience. By the 1920s, the trajectories of their careers had diverged completely. Titchener remained at Cornell, increasingly isolated as American psychology moved away from his structuralist vision. Behaviorism was rising, with its rejection of introspection altogether in favor of objective observation of behavior. Functionalism dominated, with its pragmatic focus on how mental processes served adaptive purposes. Titchener's pure structural psychology seemed to many a dead end, a European import unsuited to American temperament. He continued teaching, writing, training students, but the discipline was passing him by. When he died in 1927, structural psychology largely died with him. It had no institutional legacy, no school that carried on his methods. Within a generation, it was primarily of historical interest, a phase psychology had passed through on its way to more productive approaches. Jung, by contrast, was in these same years becoming internationally known. His book Psychological Types appeared in 1921, introducing concepts like introversion and extroversion that would enter common language. He was developing his theory of archetypes, the inherited patterns that shape human experience across cultures. He was exploring mythology, alchemy, religion, finding in these traditional symbolic systems expressions of psychological truths. His practice was flourishing. Patients came from around the world to work with him in Zurich. He was giving lectures, traveling, writing prolifically. By the time of Titchener's death, Jung was just reaching the height of his creative powers, with decades of productive work still ahead of him. The historical moment had chosen between them, or so it seemed. Psychology would be a science of behavior or a depth psychology of unconscious meaning, but not a structural analysis of conscious sensations. Titchener's vision appeared to have been a detour, an elaborate dead end. And yet, as we settle deeper into this meditation on their contrasting approaches, let us not be too quick to judge. Let us hold both visions simultaneously. Let us see what each illuminates and what each obscures. For in the tension between their methods, in the space between reduction and amplification, between element and symbol, between conscious clarity and unconscious depth, something important about the nature of psychological understanding itself may be revealed. Consider the fundamental assumptions each man brought to the study of mind. Titchener assumed that consciousness, like any natural phenomenon, could be analyzed into constituent parts. This was the method that had proven so successful in chemistry, in physics, in biology. Identify the elements, understand their properties, discover the laws by which they combine, and you will have explained the phenomenon. It was the reductionist program that had driven scientific progress for centuries, and Titchener saw no reason why it should not work for psychology as well. Consciousness might seem complex and unified in immediate experience, but patient analysis would reveal its elementary structure. Jung, increasingly, came to doubt this entire approach when applied to psyche. He did not doubt that reductive analysis had its place. In fact, he distinguished between what he called the reductive method and the synthetic method, acknowledging that sometimes it was appropriate to trace a psychological phenomenon back to its causes, to analyze it into its components. But he insisted that this was only half the story. Psyche, he believed, could not be understood only by looking backward to causes and elements. It also had to be understood by looking forward to purposes and meanings, by asking not only where does this symptom come from, but what is it trying to achieve? What meaning is struggling to be born through it? This difference in fundamental orientation manifests in everything the two men wrote and taught. When Titchener looked at a complex experience, say the experience of listening to a symphony, he sought to analyze it into its sensory components, the pure tones of different frequencies and intensities, the sensations of tension and relaxation in the body, the rise and fall of feeling tone along the dimensions of pleasure and displeasure. He would have rejected as unscientific any attempt to speak of the symphony's meaning, its emotional message, its narrative arc. These were interpretations imposed by the listener, not contents of the experience itself. Scientific psychology must stick to what can be directly observed in consciousness, and what can be observed are sensations, images, and feelings, not meanings. Jung, hearing that same symphony, would have been interested in something entirely different. What images arose spontaneously? What memories or fantasies did the music evoke? What archetypal patterns might be constellated by particular musical themes? If a patient reported being deeply moved by a symphony, Jung would want to know what it meant to them, what inner conflict or aspiration or transformation it touched. The physical sensations of hearing, the precise tones and timbres, would have seemed to Jung less psychologically significant than the symbolic resonances the music awakened. One sought the structure, the other sought the meaning. One analyzed downward into elements, the other synthesized upward into wholeness. One studied consciousness by making it as clear and still as possible. The other studied the unconscious by allowing consciousness to become fluid and imaginal. One valued precision, the other valued richness. One demanded control, the other invited spontaneity. The contrast could hardly be more complete. And yet, before we rest too comfortably. In this contrast, let us notice certain unexpected resonances, places where, despite all differences, both men were responding to similar problems, asking similar questions from opposite directions. Both were fundamentally concerned with immediate experience, with the inner world as it presents itself to the experiencing subject. Both rejected the emerging behaviorism that would reduce psychology to the study of objective behavior while ignoring subjective experience altogether. Both insisted that psychology must take consciousness seriously, must find ways to investigate the inner realm, even if such investigation posed methodological challenges. Both men also valued systematic training, though they trained observers in opposite directions. Titchener's observers learned to attend to sensory qualities while ignoring meaning. Jung's patients learned to attend to symbolic meaning while relaxing their grip on sensory reality. Both recognized that the naive, untrained mind could not simply report its own experience accurately. The mind must be educated, must learn to observe itself in particular ways. Where they differed was in what kind of self-observation they sought to cultivate. Perhaps most intriguingly, both men were in their different ways trying to map a territory that seemed to exceed the grasp of existing scientific methods. Titchener wanted consciousness to be as accessible to science as any physical phenomenon. But consciousness is not a physical phenomenon. It is private, subjective, accessible only to the experiencing person. Titchener tried to solve this problem through trained introspection, creating observers who could report their experiences with sufficient reliability and precision that patterns could be discerned and laws formulated. It was an admirable attempt, but ultimately it failed, partly because consciousness proved far more variable and less elementally structured than his theory assumed. Jung faced a different but related problem. The unconscious, by definition, is not directly observable. How then can one study it scientifically? Jung's solution was to study its manifestations, its products, the ways it expressed itself indirectly through symptoms, dreams, fantasies, creative works. He could not observe the archetype itself, but he could observe the archetypal image as it appeared in consciousness. He could not peer directly into the collective unconscious, but he could trace the patterns that appeared again and again across different individuals and cultures, pointing to some common underlying structure. Both men were thus engaged in the difficult project of making the invisible visible, of finding methods to study phenomena that cannot be directly observed or measured in the way physical objects can. Both struggled with the tension between scientific rigor and the elusive nature of their subject matter. Both faced criticism that their methods were too subjective, too unreliable, too dependent on the particular training and perspective of the observer. The difference lay in their response to this challenge. Titchener responded by tightening control, by making his methods more rigorous and his training more demanding, by excluding anything that seemed too variable or subjective. Jung responded by loosening control, by acknowledging the irreducible subjectivity of psychological experience, by developing methods that embraced rather than eliminated the personal and the imaginal. In the quiet of this late hour, as consciousness itself begins to soften and the day's clear categories start to blur, we might sense that both responses have validity, that each captures something true about the double nature of psyche. There is in consciousness something precise and elemental, a sensory foundation, a basic structure of qualities and intensities that Titchener was trying to articulate. And there is in psyche something fluid and symbolic, a depth dimension that constantly generates meaning and image that Jung was trying to explore. Perhaps the tragedy is not that one was right and the other wrong, but that their approaches remained so completely separate, never finding a way to complement each other, never discovering how the analysis of conscious elements and the interpretation of unconscious symbols might together produce a more complete understanding. Let us turn now to examine their methods in greater detail, descending into the specific practices each man developed to explore the inner realm. We will move slowly, attending carefully to the textures of their different approaches, feeling the distinct atmosphere of Titchener's laboratory and Jung's consulting room, understanding how method shapes what can be discovered. In Titchener's laboratory at Cornell, a typical introspection session was a carefully orchestrated event. The room would be arranged to minimize distractions. The subject, usually a trained graduate student, would be seated in a comfortable chair, perhaps in a darkened room or with a screen to block extraneous stimuli. The experimenter would present a stimulus, perhaps a color patch, a tone, a weight. The subject's task was to observe the conscious experience that resulted, not to name the stimulus or judge it or associate to it, but simply to report the sensory qualities present in awareness. This required extensive practice. Subjects had to learn to overcome their natural tendency to leap immediately to recognition. When shown red, the untrained observer says, "Red." But this is, for Titchener, already an interpretation, already a step beyond pure sensation. The trained observer must report instead the specific quality of the sensation, its hue and brightness and saturation, its position in the visual field, its distinctness or vagueness. They must separate the sensation itself from any knowledge about its source, any associations or meanings it might carry. Imagine the discipline this required. Imagine sitting in the darkened laboratory, attending with minute precision to the exact quality of a sound, resisting all the mind's natural tendencies to wander, to interpret, to connect. It is almost a meditative practice, but a meditation aimed not at transcending or dissolving consciousness, but at clarifying it, at making its structure visible. In this sense, Titchener's method shares something with certain contemplative traditions, with practices of bare attention or choiceless awareness, though Titchener himself would never have acknowledged such a connection. For him, this was pure science, nothing mystical about it. The data generated by these introspections were carefully recorded, often in tabular form. Titchener collected thousands of introspective reports, looking for patterns, for regularities that might reveal the laws of conscious experience. He was building, he believed, a systematic map of the mind, as detailed and reliable as an anatomist's map of the body. Each sensation had its qualities, could be characterized along various dimensions. Images were faint sensations, memory traces. Feelings came in their 3 dimensions. Complex experiences were combinations of these elements, arising according to principles of association, of contiguity and contrast and similarity. There is something both impressive and limiting about this project. Impressive in its ambition, its systematic rigor, its refusal to be content with vague generalities about mental life. Titchener wanted precision, wanted to know exactly what was present in consciousness and how these contents related to each other, but limiting because this method could only capture a thin slice of experience, the sensory surface, the immediate contents of awareness. Everything that gives experience its human significance, its personal meaning, its emotional depth, was deliberately excluded as beyond the scope of structural analysis. Now let us cross the Atlantic and move forward in time, entering Jung's consulting room in Küsnacht in the 1920s or 30s. The atmosphere here is entirely different. The room is filled with books, artifacts, art objects. The light is perhaps softer, the space more intimate. Jung sits across from a patient, listening as they recount a dream. The dream is strange, numinous. The patient found themselves in a great cathedral, but the altar was a living tree, and birds with golden feathers were singing in its branches. The patient woke feeling inexplicably moved, as if they had touched something sacred. How does Jung work with this material? He does not analyze it into sensory elements. He does not ask the patient to report the precise visual qualities of the imagined cathedral or the exact tonal qualities of the bird's song. Rather, he asks the patient to amplify the images, to explore their associations and resonances. What does the cathedral remind you of? What feelings arise when you imagine the living tree? Have you seen birds like these before, in art or mythology or childhood memory? What do these symbols mean to you personally, and what might they mean universally in the symbolic vocabulary of human culture? The conversation might range widely, touching on Christian symbolism and pagan nature worship, on the patient's relationship with institutional religion, on the psychological meaning of trees as symbols of growth and grounding, on birds as messengers between earth and sky, body and spirit. Jung might reach for a book, showing the patient similar images from alchemical texts or myths from distant cultures, demonstrating that these symbols have appeared again and again throughout human history. The image is not reduced to its components, but expanded, placed in ever wider contexts, until it reveals levels of meaning the patient had not consciously intended, but which resonate deeply nonetheless. This is Jung's synthetic method, his way of working with symbolic material. Where Titchener's introspection moved toward simplicity, toward the isolation of elementary sensations, Jung's active imagination moves toward complexity, toward the elaboration of symbolic meaning. The goal is not to strip away what the image seems to mean in order to find what it really is at an elemental level. The goal is to unpack what the image means at multiple levels simultaneously, to discover how it connects personal experience to collective patterns, how it expresses in symbolic form something the patient needs to understand about their own life and development. For Jung, the image is not a simple sensation or a weak copy of sensation. It is a symbol, a carrier of meaning that exceeds any single interpretation. The tree at the altar might speak to the patient's need to reconnect with nature, to find the sacred outside institutional forms. It might also represent the self, the integrating center of the psyche, the axis mundi that connects consciousness and unconscious. It might reflect the patient's individuation process, the growth toward wholeness symbolized by a living, growing organism. All these meanings can be simultaneously present, layered within the single image. This way of working requires a different kind of training than Titchener's method demanded. Jung's students had to learn not precise observation of sensory qualities, but sensitivity to symbolic resonance. They had to develop wide cultural knowledge, familiarity with mythology and religion and art, so they could recognize archetypal patterns wherever they appeared. They had to cultivate what Jung called a symbolic attitude, a willingness to see through the literal to the metaphorical, to understand that psyche speaks in images that mean more than they say. Perhaps most importantly, they had to learn to engage their own imagination, to be participants rather than detached observers. When Jung practiced active imagination himself, He entered into dialogue with the figures that appeared. He asked them questions, challenged them, learned from them. His encounter with Philemon, a wise old man figure who appeared repeatedly in his visions, was for Jung an encounter with a part of his own psyche that nevertheless seemed to possess knowledge and perspective beyond his conscious understanding. This was not rigorous observation in Titchener's sense. It was more like a waking dream, a creative exploration that blurred the boundary between discovery and invention. To Titchener, this would have seemed the very opposite of scientific method. How could Jung claim to be observing the psyche when he was actively interacting with it, changing it through his participation? Where was the objectivity, the detachment, the careful separation of observer and observed that science required? Jung's method seemed to conflate imagination and observation, to mistake fantasy for fact, to build elaborate theoretical structures on foundations of pure subjectivity. But Jung would have replied that objectivity of Titchener's sort was impossible when studying the psyche and actually undesirable. The psyche cannot be observed from outside because we are always already inside it. We have no standpoint beyond our own consciousness from which to observe consciousness objectively. The attempt to achieve such detachment, to strip away meaning and context and personal significance, produces not objective knowledge but merely an impoverished slice of experience, the sensory surface mistaken for the whole. Furthermore, Jung argued, the unconscious is not a static thing that can be observed like a specimen under glass. It is a living, creative process, constantly generating new contents, responding to the questions we bring to it. To study the unconscious, we must engage with it, must enter into relationship with it. Active imagination is not a corruption of objective observation, but the only method appropriate to its subject matter. We come to know the unconscious not by standing apart from it, but by participating in its processes, by allowing it to speak in its own language of symbol and image. Here we encounter a fundamental epistemological divide. Titchener's method assumed that proper scientific observation requires the observer to remain separate from and unaffected by the observed. Bias and subjectivity enter when the observer's own thoughts and feelings color what they report. Training in introspection was meant to minimize such contamination, to create observers who could report the facts of consciousness without interpretation. Jung's method assumed that such separation was illusory when studying the psyche. The observer is part of the psyche they observe. Their own unconscious is involved in every interpretation, every perception, every theoretical formulation. Rather than trying futilely to eliminate this subjectivity, Jung embraced it, demanded that the psychologist undertake their own analysis, their own confrontation with the unconscious, so they would know themselves and thus be able to distinguish their own complexes from those of their patients. This difference manifested in how each man understood psychological data itself. For Titchener, data were the introspective reports of trained observers, recorded systematically under controlled conditions. These reports could be compared, averaged, analyzed for patterns. Individual variation was noise to be minimized through careful method. The goal was to discover universal laws of conscious experience, true for all normal adult human minds. For Jung, data were something much more various: a dream, a fantasy, a symptom, a creative work, a myth, a religious ritual, an alchemical text. All could be psychological data if they revealed something about the workings of the psyche. And individual variation was not noise, but signal, the unique way each person's psyche manifested universal patterns. Jung was not trying to discover laws in Titchener's sense, universal regularities that held in every case. He was trying to identify patterns, archetypal motifs that appeared again and again, but always in individual form, adapted to particular circumstances and personalities. The implications of these different approaches can be seen most clearly when we consider how each man would have handled the same psychological phenomenon. Let us imagine a case. A man who reports experiencing vivid visual imagery just before falling asleep. He sees faces, landscapes, geometric patterns, sometimes quite beautiful and compelling. He cannot control these images. They arise spontaneously, but he is fascinated by them and has learned to observe them without quite falling asleep. Titchener, hearing of this phenomenon, which we now call hypnagogic imagery, would have been interested in its structural properties. What exactly is the quality of these images? How do they differ from waking perceptions, from memories, from deliberate imaginings? Are they more or less clear than ordinary sensations? How long do they last? Do they combine according to any discernible patterns? He might have trained the man to report more precisely on the sensory qualities of the experience, trying to map hypnagogic imagery's place in the larger structure of conscious experience. This investigation would have been valuable in its way, a careful phenomenological description of a particular type of mental content. But notice what it would have missed entirely. It would not have asked what the images meant, whether they expressed anything about the man's psychological state or unconscious processes. It would not have explored whether the content of the images, the particular faces or landscapes that appeared, had any significance. It would have treated the images as neutral data, interesting only for their formal properties, not for anything they might be trying to communicate. Jung would have approached the same phenomenon from an entirely different angle. He would have been very interested in what images appeared and why. These particular images. Are the faces recognizable? If so, who are they and what do they represent to the dreamer? If not, do they have any archetypal quality, any mythological or symbolic resonance? What about the landscapes? Do they correspond to actual places, or are they imaginary? What is the emotional tone? Are the geometric patterns, mandalas, those circular forms that Jung saw as symbols of the self? Jung might have encouraged the man to use this hypnagogic state deliberately, to enter it with the intention of observing what emerged, perhaps even to ask questions and see what images arose in response. This would be a form of active imagination, using the threshold state between waking and sleeping as a doorway to the unconscious. The content of the images would be data of the highest significance, potentially revealing complexes, archetypal patterns, aspects of the personality seeking expression. Where Titchener would have analyzed the structure of the experience, Jung would have interpreted its meaning. Where Titchener would have sought universal properties of hypnagogic imagery, Jung would have sought individual significance in this particular person's images. Where Titchener would have maintained objectivity and detachment, Jung would have encouraged participation and amplification. Neither approach is complete on its own. Titchener's method captures something real about the formal properties of consciousness, the ways sensory qualities can be distinguished and related. Jung's method captures something real about the meaningful content of experience, the ways images express and communicate psychological truths. The tragedy is that these approaches remained so separate, so mutually exclusive, that practitioners of one dismissed the value of the other. Consider another example, one more charged with emotional and personal significance. A woman comes to Jung suffering from recurrent dreams of being chased through dark corridors by a shadowy male figure. She always wakes before being caught, her heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The dreams have been occurring for months, and she is beginning to dread sleep. If this woman had somehow found her way to Titchener instead, what would have happened? Titchener did not work with patients, did not see himself as a clinician, so the encounter itself is unlikely. But let us imagine he tried to approach her experience scientifically, to apply introspective method to her dreams. He might have asked her to describe the sensory qualities of the dream experience. How dark were the corridors? What specific visual sensations constituted the shadowy figure? What bodily sensations accompanied the fear? What was the quality and intensity of the anxiety? This would have given a precise phenomenological description of the dream experience, but it would have offered no help, no interpretation, no path toward resolving the suffering these dreams caused. For Titchener, offering such help would not have been the psychologist's job. He was a scientist, not a therapist. His goal was understanding, not healing. Jung, of course, would have worked with this material very differently. He would have wanted to know about the woman's life situation, her relationships, her conflicts and challenges. He would have explored her associations to the elements of the dream. What do dark corridors remind you of? Who might the shadowy figure be? What aspects of masculinity does he represent? Is there something in your life you are fleeing from? Some confrontation you are avoiding? Through careful exploration, patterns might emerge. Perhaps the shadowy figure represents the woman's rejected masculinity, her animus, the masculine potential within her psyche that she has suppressed or feared. Perhaps the chase represents her resistance to integrating this aspect of herself. The work would then become helping her to turn and face the figure, to discover what he wants, what gift or challenge he brings. Through active imagination, she might dialogue with the figure, ask him who he is, what he wants from her, gradually transforming him from pursuer into guide. This process might lead to genuine healing, to an expansion of personality, to the integration of previously rejected aspects of self. But it would not have produced anything Titchener would recognize as scientific knowledge. It was too individual, too interpretive, too embedded in a particular therapeutic relationship. The same dream in another woman might mean something entirely different. There were no universal laws here, only individual meanings discovered through a kind of collaborative creativity. And yet, might there be a way to value both approaches, to see what each contributes to a full understanding? The precise phenomenological description of consciousness that Titchener sought is not worthless. There is value in understanding the formal structure of experience, the ways sensations and images and feelings combine and interact. This is the realm of cognitive science, of neuroscience, of all the contemporary approaches that seek to understand consciousness through careful, empirical investigation. Similarly, the interpretation of symbolic meaning that Jung practiced is not mere fantasy. There is genuine knowledge to be gained from understanding how symbols work, how they carry multiple levels of meaning, how they connect personal experience to collective patterns. This is the realm of depth psychology, of psychotherapy, of all the approaches that take seriously the proposition that psychological symptoms and dreams and creative works are meaningful, that they say something about the psyche that produced them. Perhaps the deepest difference between Titchener and Jung lies not in their methods, but in their fundamental understanding of what the psyche is. For Titchener, mind was essentially a collection of contents, sensations and images and feelings that occurred in consciousness according to natural laws. These contents combined, associated, formed patterns, but there was no implication of purpose or meaning beyond the mechanisms of their combination. Mind was a natural phenomenon, to be studied like any other natural phenomenon, without importing anthropomorphic notions of intention or significance. For Jung, psyche was a creative process, a living reality that generated meaning, that had purposes and directions, that moved toward wholeness and self-realization. It was not merely a mechanism but an organism, not merely a collection of elements but an integrated totality constantly seeking fuller integration. To study psyche meant to understand its purposes, to read its symbols, to cooperate with its movement toward completion. These are ultimately different ontologies, different visions of the nature of mental reality. And from such different starting points, it is perhaps inevitable that methods and conclusions diverge so completely. Titchener saw consciousness as structure. Jung saw psyche as story. Titchener analyzed. Jung interpreted. Titchener reduced. Jung amplified. Each was true to his own vision, developing methods appropriate to what he understood the psyche to be. In the deep stillness of this hour, as we rest between these two visions, we might feel how each offers a kind of truth, how each illuminates aspects of experience that remain shadowed in the other. There is a place for analysis, for careful attention to the structure of consciousness, and there's a place for imagination, for following symbols into depth. The question is whether these can ever be genuinely integrated or whether they represent fundamentally incompatible approaches that must remain separate. Let us descend deeper now into specific concepts and techniques, examining in greater detail how Titchener's structural psychology and Jung's analytical psychology approach the core questions of psychological science. We will move slowly, meditatively, allowing the full texture of each approach to reveal itself, noticing both the sharp contrasts and the subtle resonances that emerge when these two systems are held side by side in contemplative awareness. Titchener made a crucial distinction between structure and function, between what consciousness is and what consciousness does. This distinction was his primary line of defense against the functionalist psychology that was becoming dominant in America. William James, John Dewey, and other functionalists argued that mental processes should be understood in terms of their adaptive purposes, their role in helping organisms survive and flourish. Consciousness existed because it served useful functions, and psychology should study those functions. Titchener rejected this approach vehemently. He argued that structure must be understood before function can be properly investigated. You must know what consciousness is, what its elements and their combinations are, before you can meaningfully ask what consciousness does. To conflate the two questions was to introduce confusion, to mix explanation with description. Structural psychology was pure description, an attempt to map the basic elements and laws of conscious experience without regard for adaptive purposes or practical applications. This insistence on separating structure from function had profound consequences for Titchener's psychology. It meant that meaning itself became suspect, for meaning seems intrinsically functional, seems to involve the relationship between mental content and purposes, between representations and the world they represent. Titchener tried to study consciousness without reference to what consciousness was about, and this led to an increasingly formalistic system that seemed disconnected from the rich, intentional character of lived experience. Jung never made such a distinction between structure and function. For him, the psyche's structure was inseparable from its purposes. Archetypes were not just formal patterns, but dynamic factors, sources of psychological energy organized around particular themes and goals. The self was both a structure, the organizing center of the personality, and a goal, the wholeness toward which individuation aimed. To understand any psychological phenomenon, Jung believed you had to understand both what it was and what it was for, both its form and its purpose. This difference manifests clearly in how each man approached the question of psychological elements. Titchener devoted enormous effort to identifying the basic elements of consciousness. He settled on three kinds: sensations, images, and feelings. Each sensation had certain attributes: quality, intensity, duration, clearness, and sometimes extent. A red sensation differed from a blue sensation in quality. A loud sound differed from a soft sound in intensity. These were the irreducible atoms of conscious experience, the building blocks from which all mental life was constructed. But Jung had no interest in identifying psychological elements in this sense. He did not believe psyche could be broken down into simple components that existed independently of their combinations. Rather, he saw psyche as inherently holistic, as organized from the beginning into meaningful patterns. The archetype was his closest equivalent to Titchener's element, but archetypes were not simple building blocks. They were complex patterns, organizations of energy and image and meaning that could not be reduced further without losing their essential character. Consider the archetype of the mother. For Jung, this was a fundamental pattern in the psyche, an inherited tendency to form images and emotions and behaviors around the maternal theme. It manifested in countless variations: the personal mother, the earth mother, the terrible mother, the virgin mother. It could be projected onto women, onto nature, onto institutions. It carried ambivalent qualities: nurturing and devouring, protective and possessive. To understand the mother archetype, you could not break it into simpler elements. You had to see it whole, to trace its transformations across different contexts while recognizing the continuity of the underlying pattern. Titchener would have found this notion of archetype scientifically useless. It was too vague, too variable, too interpretive. Where were the clear boundaries? How could you distinguish the mother archetype from the father archetype or the self archetype? What precise observations would allow you to identify an archetype's presence? Jung's answer would have been that you recognize archetypes through their characteristic imagery, their emotional tone, their mythological associations. But this seemed to Titchener mere subjective interpretation, not objective observation. The issue of objectivity was central to their divergence. Titchener believed passionately that psychology could and must be objective in the same sense physics was objective, trained. Observers reporting on their sensory experience under controlled conditions could achieve the same kind of intersubjective reliability that scientists achieved when measuring physical phenomena. Different observers, properly trained, would give the same introspective reports when presented with the same stimuli. Psychology could thus escape the merely subjective and achieve genuine scientific status. Jung came to believe that objectivity, in Titchener's sense, was neither possible nor desirable in psychology. The unconscious was not objective in the sense of existing independently of the observer. Rather, observer and observed were always interacting, always influencing each other. The psychologist's own unconscious was involved in every observation and interpretation. Jung demanded that analysts undergo their own analysis precisely to make them aware of their own subjectivity, so they could account for it rather than naively believing they had achieved objectivity by following method. This led to a fundamental difference in how each approached psychological knowledge. Titchener sought universal laws, generalizations that would hold for all normal adult human consciousness. Individual differences were sources of error, to be minimized through proper method and averaged away through statistical analysis. The goal was to discover what was universal in mental structure, the laws that applied regardless of individual or cultural variation. Jung was interested in something quite different. He did believe in universals, the archetypes that appeared across all cultures and times, but these universals manifested only through individual variations. You could never observe the archetype itself, only its particular expression in this person's dream, that culture's myth, this patient's symptom. The skill of the analyst lay in recognizing the universal pattern within the individual expression, seeing how personal and collective intertwined in each unique case. This meant that Jungian psychology required a different kind of knowledge than Titchener's structural psychology. The Jungian analyst needed vast cultural knowledge, familiarity with world mythology, religious symbolism, artistic traditions, alchemical texts. They needed this knowledge not to impose it on patients, but to recognize patterns when they appeared spontaneously. When a patient dreamed of a dismemberment and reassembly, the analyst who knew the Dionysian mysteries or shamanic initiation rites could recognize this as a death-rebirth motif, an archetypal pattern of transformation. Without such knowledge, the dream might seem merely bizarre. Titchener's observers needed no such cultural knowledge. In fact, it might be a liability, tempting them to interpret rather than simply report. They needed training in precise observation, in distinguishing qualities and attributes, in reporting without contaminating sensory data with conceptual knowledge. Their knowledge was of method, of how to observe, consciousness properly, not of symbols and their meanings. Perhaps nowhere is their difference clearer than in how each understood and worked with images. For Titchener, images were simply weak sensations, memory traces, revisualized perceptions lacking the clarity and intensity of actual sensory experience. When you imagine an apple, you have a faint copy of the visual sensation you would have if actually perceiving an apple. Images could be studied introspectively, their qualities analyzed just like sensations, but they were derivative, secondary phenomena, less important than the sensations from which they derived. For Jung, images were primary, the fundamental language of the psyche. The unconscious communicated through images, and these images were not mere copies of sensations but original creations, symbols that carried meaning beyond their sensory content. The mandala forms that appeared in his patient's dreams and drawings were not just circular shapes but representations of the self. The alchemical images of death and rebirth were not just pictures but symbols of psychological transformation. Images had power, numinosity, autonomy. They arose spontaneously from unconscious depths, bringing with them energies and meanings that consciousness had not intended. This difference in understanding images led to entirely different practices. Titchener's subjects reported on the sensory qualities of images, their clearness or vagueness, their stability or fluctuation. They treated images as objects of neutral observation. Jung's patients engaged with images, amplified them, allowed them to transform. dialogued with the figures that appeared in them. Images were not objects, but living presences, personalities from the inner world with whom one could have relationships. Imagine a patient who reports an image that keeps recurring, perhaps a great tree with spreading roots and reaching branches. For Titchener's introspective method, the task would be to describe this image precisely. What specific shades of brown is the bark? How clear is the image compared to actual perception? Does it include details like individual leaves, or is it more schematic? How long does the image persist? Does it remain stable or shift and change? All of these are legitimate questions about the phenomenology of the image experience. But Jung would ask entirely different questions. What does the tree mean to you? What associations arise when you contemplate it? Does it connect to any memories, any stories, any symbols you know? What happens if you imagine yourself approaching the tree, touching it, sitting beneath it? If the tree could speak, what might it say? These questions move beyond description to engagement, treating the image not as a static object to be observed, but as a dynamic symbol to be explored. Jung would also be interested in the tree as a universal symbol, appearing across many cultures as the axis mundi, the world tree that connects underworld and heavens, roots, and crown. He might show the patient images of Yggdrasil from Norse mythology, or the Bodhi tree under which Buddha achieved enlightenment, or the tree of life from Kabbalah, or the alchemical philosophical tree. Not to tell the patient what their image means, but to show them the symbolic field in which it participates, the archetypal pattern it manifests. For Titchener, this amplification process would have seemed completely unscientific, a proliferation of interpretations and associations that moved ever further from the actual data of the image experience itself. He would have insisted on sticking with what could be directly observed, the sensory qualities of the image in this person's consciousness. Everything else was speculation, contamination of observation with interpretation. And yet, from Jung's perspective, Titchener's approach would miss everything psychologically significant about the image. The sensory qualities are less important than the symbolic, meaning the image matters because of what it expresses, what it communicates from unconscious to conscious, what transformation or realization it makes possible. To study only its formal properties while ignoring its content is like studying the chemical composition of ink while ignoring the words written with it. This leads us to perhaps the most fundamental difference: their understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. For Titchener, there simply was no unconscious in the dynamic sense that Freud and Jung proposed. There was consciousness, the field of immediate awareness, and there were physiological processes that underlaid consciousness, neural events that produced or correlated with conscious experience. But there was no second psychic realm, no unconscious mind with its own contents and dynamics. When Titchener spoke of the unconscious at all, he meant only what was currently outside attention, temporarily not conscious, but available to. Consciousness. The sound of a clock ticking might be unconscious until you direct attention to it, at which point it becomes conscious. Or there might be unconscious in the sense of automatic processes, learned behaviors that no longer require conscious attention. But these were not an unconscious mind in the sense of a separate system with its own purposes and symbolic language. Jung's entire psychology, by contrast, rested on the reality and autonomy of the unconscious. The unconscious was not just an absence of consciousness, but a positive presence, a realm of psychic activity that influenced behavior and experience profoundly. Dreams, fantasies, symptoms, slips of the tongue, all expressed unconscious content seeking to enter awareness. The unconscious had its own intelligence, its own perspectives that often differed from or opposed those of consciousness. The art of psychology lay in learning to read the messages from the unconscious, to understand what it was trying to communicate. More radically still, Jung proposed that beneath or beyond the personal unconscious lay the collective unconscious, the inherited patterns and potentials common to all humanity. This was not learned from experience, but given prior to experience, the psychological equivalent of instinct. The archetypes were contents of the collective unconscious, and they shaped human experience from the beginning, organizing perception and emotion and behavior around universal themes. To Titchener, this entire edifice would have seemed metaphysical fantasy, utterly beyond the reach of scientific verification. How could you observe the unconscious if by definition it was not conscious? How could you study inherited psychological patterns when you could only observe the individual's current experience? Jung claimed to infer the unconscious from its effects, but such inference seemed to Titchener radically underdetermined by the evidence. You could always imagine many different unconscious causes for any conscious effect, and there was no way to adjudicate between them. Jung agreed that you could not observe the unconscious directly, but insisted you could study its manifestations systematically. When the same symbolic patterns appeared across different individuals who had no contact with each other, across different cultures separated by time and space, this pointed to some common source. When patients produced images they had never encountered in their personal experience, but which matched ancient alchemical or mythological motifs, this suggested access to a transpersonal realm. The evidence was indirect but cumulative, building a case for the collective unconscious through the convergence of many observations. Their different views on consciousness and the unconscious shaped how they understood psychological problems and healing. For Titchener, psychological problems were not really his concern. He was not a clinician and did not claim his structural psychology had therapeutic applications. If pressed, he might have suggested that disorders involved some malfunction in the normal operation of psychological elements and laws, but this was speculation beyond his area of expertise. Jung saw psychological problems as fundamentally meaningful. Symptoms were messages from the unconscious, attempts by the psyche to restore balance, to bring consciousness to something it was ignoring or suppressing. A phobia might symbolically express something the person feared to confront directly. A depression might result from consciousness losing touch with its energy source in the unconscious. Healing came not from suppressing symptoms, but from understanding their meaning, integrating the unconscious content they expressed. This led to completely different therapeutic approaches. Titchener had no therapeutic approach, or rather, his approach to understanding consciousness had no therapeutic dimension. Jung's entire method was therapeutic, aimed at fostering individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. This involved making the unconscious conscious, but not in the sense of simply remembering forgotten experiences. It meant establishing a relationship with the unconscious, learning its symbolic language, allowing its wisdom to balance the one-sidedness of consciousness. Consider the case of a successful businessman who comes to Jung complaining of emptiness despite his achievements. He has money, status, respect, but feels his life lacks meaning. His dreams are vivid but disturbing. He dreams repeatedly of being in primitive landscapes, encountering wild animals, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. Titchener would have had nothing to offer this man. The problem was not one of conscious structure, not a question of how sensations combined or images associated. It was a problem of meaning, of purpose, of the relationship between conscious attitude and unconscious needs. Structural psychology had no tools for addressing such questions. Jung would recognize this as a classic case of one-sided development. The man had developed his rational, goal-oriented, socially adapted side, his persona, but at the cost of repressing his instinctual, emotional, wild nature. The unconscious was compensating through dreams, trying to restore balance by presenting images of what consciousness had rejected. The work would involve helping the man to recognize and integrate his shadow, the primitive aspects of himself he had deemed unacceptable. Through active imagination with the wild animals in his dreams, through amplification of the primitive landscape as a symbolic realm he needed to explore, the man might reconnect with his instinctual base and find the sense of vitality and meaning that purely rational achievement could not provide. This therapeutic process would involve no analysis of conscious elements, no introspective reporting of sensory qualities. It would be an imaginative exploration, a symbolic journey, a gradual transformation of attitude and personality. And it would work when it worked, not because it discovered scientific laws, but because it helped the person find personal meaning, discover their own myth, to integrate previously split aspects of self into a more complete whole. We might pause here in our contemplation to notice something interesting. Despite their profound differences, both Titchener and Jung were in their way concerned with wholeness, with understanding the complete structure of consciousness or psyche. Titchener wanted to map all the elements and laws of conscious experience to achieve a complete structural account. Jung wanted to foster psychological wholeness, the integration of consciousness and unconscious into the self. One sought intellectual wholeness, a complete theory. The other sought lived wholeness, a complete personality. But both felt the pull toward totality, toward achieving or revealing a complete vision. Perhaps this is part of what made both men so absolutist in their approaches, so resistant to compromise or synthesis with competing views. Titchener defended his structural psychology against all comers, dismissing functionalism and behaviorism and psychoanalysis as deviations from true scientific psychology. Jung, especially after his break with Freud, insisted on the autonomy and validity of his analytical psychology, rejecting attempts to reduce it to other frameworks. Each had seen a vision of the whole and could not rest content with partial accounts, and yet their wholes were so different, oriented in such opposite directions, that reconciliation seemed impossible. Titchener's whole was horizontal, extensive, a complete catalog of elements and laws. Jung's whole was vertical, intensive, a complete integration of conscious and unconscious depths. One mapped the surface with ever greater precision. The other plumbed the depths with ever greater sensitivity to symbolic meaning. Let us consider now their different relationships with language, for language was central to both projects, yet functioned entirely differently in each system. Titchener demanded precise technical language for describing conscious contents. He developed elaborate vocabularies for characterizing sensations and images and feelings, trying to capture subtle distinctions that ordinary language overlooked. His introspective reports were almost like a private language, comprehensible only to those trained in his system, designed to minimize ambiguity and maximize precision. Jung, by contrast, embraced the ambiguity and multivalence of symbolic language. He used myth, poetry, alchemical texts, religious scripture, all forms of discourse that spoke through symbol and metaphor rather than literal description. He valued language that pointed beyond itself, that evoked rather than defined, that could carry multiple meanings simultaneously. His own writing style was often dense, elusive, circling around its topics rather than proceeding linearly, trying to convey through its very form something of how the psyche operates. These different relationships with language reflected different epistemologies. Titchener believed that precise observation required precise language. Ambiguity was the enemy of science. Every term must be clearly defined, every description as exact as possible. Only through such linguistic discipline could psychology achieve the clarity and reliability of physics or chemistry. Jung believed that the psyche's truths could not be captured in literal language. Symbols were not failed descriptions that could be replaced by precise scientific terms. They were the only appropriate language for psychological realities that exceeded rational comprehension. The self could not be defined precisely because it was not a clearly bounded concept, but a living reality that manifested differently in each individual. You could only approach it through symbols, through images that evoked its nature without claiming to exhaust its meaning. This difference manifests in how each man wrote. Titchener's texts are systematic, organized, building carefully from definitions through increasingly complex structures. He wrote textbooks, manuals, theoretical treatises that aimed at comprehensive exposition. His writing was meant to teach method and theory clearly, to transmit his system to students who would then apply it properly. Jung's texts are exploratory, associative, often deliberately unsystematic. He circled around his topics, approaching them from different angles, piling up examples and parallels, allowing meaning to accumulate through repetition and variation rather than proceeding by logical proof. He wrote for readers who would engage actively with his texts, who would allow his images and ideas to work on them, who would bring their own imagination and experience to the interpretive process. Contemporary readers often find Titchener clear but dry, easy to understand but hard to care about. The systematic precision that he valued can seem emotionally flat, disconnected from lived experience. Jung, by contrast, is often unclear but compelling, difficult to pin down but emotionally resonant. The very qualities that made his work seem unscientific to critics made it feel psychologically true to readers seeking meaning. This leads us to consider their different relationships with science itself, with the question of what makes psychology scientific. Titchener had a 19th century model of science based on physics and chemistry, emphasizing precise measurement, controlled experimentation, universal laws. Psychology must conform to this model or give up any claim to scientific status. This meant excluding much that seemed psychological, including emotion, motivation, meaning, purpose, everything that resisted precise measurement and experimental control. Jung had a more expansive view of science, one that included systematic observation and theoretical coherence, but did not demand that psychology mimic physics. Psyche was not like matter. It could not be isolated, controlled, measured in the same ways. Psychology needed methods appropriate to its subject matter, methods that took seriously the subjective, the meaningful, the individual. This was still science, in the sense of disciplined inquiry aimed at understanding, but not science in the narrow sense Titchener demanded. This difference reflected the broader crisis of psychology in the early 20th century, a crisis that remains unresolved. Can there be a science of subjectivity? Can inner experience be studied with the same rigor as outer behavior? Must psychology choose between scientific respectability and psychological relevance? Titchener chose rigor at the cost of relevance. Jung chose relevance at the risk of appearing unrigorous. Neither synthesis seemed possible within their frameworks. As we approach the threshold of sleep, as consciousness itself begins to loosen its grip and the day's clear categories start to blur, we might sense that this unresolved tension between Titchener and Jung reflects something fundamental about the nature of mind itself. Consciousness has both a structure and a meaning, both a form and a content. It can be observed from outside, as it were, attending to its mechanics, or from inside, attending to its significance. Neither view is complete without the other, yet they seem to require incompatible methods. Titchener gave us a map of consciousness as structure, precise and limited. Jung gave us a vision of psyche as process, rich and imprecise. We need both, but they don't fit together. They remain two separate approaches to the mystery of mind, each illuminating what the other leaves in shadow, each unable to fully comprehend or incorporate what the other reveals. Let us drift now into the third movement of our meditation, leaving behind the biographical details and technical tour, comparisons, allowing ourselves to float freely in the space between these two visions, listening for what their dialogue across time and method might teach us about consciousness, psyche, and the paradoxes of self-knowledge. There is a certain poignancy in the meeting that never happened, the conversation that Titchener and Jung never had. They were contemporaries for decades, both publishing throughout the 1910s and 20s, yet their paths never crossed. Titchener remained at Cornell, increasingly isolated as American psychology moved away from introspectionism. Jung traveled widely, lectured internationally, but not in circles where he would encounter Titchener. Each developed his system independently, perhaps dimly aware of the other's existence, but seeing no reason for dialogue. And yet, in the imaginal space where the history of ideas unfolds, we can picture their meeting. Perhaps in a library that exists outside time, where all books are present simultaneously, where great minds can encounter each other freed from the constraints of mortality and historical circumstance. Titchener is there, surrounded by his introspective protocols and tabulated results. Jung is there, his desk piled with alchemical texts and patient case histories. What would they say to each other? Titchener might begin by acknowledging the legitimacy of Jung's questions. Of course, people seek meaning, wonder about purpose, are moved by symbols and myths. But these are not psychological questions in the strict sense. They are philosophical questions, spiritual questions, perhaps medical questions insofar as they relate to mental health. Psychology, as a science, must restrict itself to what can be observed and measured, must study the structure of consciousness as it is, not the meanings we read into it. Jung might respond gently, acknowledging the value of precise observation, while questioning whether Titchener's method actually observes consciousness as it is, or only a thin slice of it. Lived consciousness is always already meaningful. We never experience pure sensations, but always objects invested with significance. To strip away meaning in the attempt to find pure sensation is not to reveal consciousness as it naturally is, but to create an artificial condition, interesting perhaps, but not fundamental. The meaningful experience is the natural condition. The meaningless sensation is the laboratory artifact. Titchener would object. But meaning is subjective, variable, dependent on individual history and culture. If psychology studies meaning, it can never achieve the universality science requires. Different individuals, Different cultures, different times will find different meanings in the same experience. Where are the laws? Where is the scientific progress? We will be left with mere description of individual cases, with hermeneutics instead of science. Jung would agree that meanings vary, but insist that patterns recur. The same archetypal themes appear across vastly different contexts. The hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the transformation of self. These are not arbitrary or infinitely variable, but structured, patterned, limited in their possible forms. This is the universality psychology needs, not the universality of sensory elements, but the universality of symbolic patterns. And yes, these patterns require interpretation, but interpretation can be disciplined, systematic, grounded in comparative study of mythology and symbolism across cultures. Titchener would remain unconvinced. How do you verify an interpretation? How do you know your reading of a symbol is correct rather than merely plausible? Different analysts might interpret the same dream differently. Where is the reliability, the intersubjective agreement that science demands? At least with introspective reports, you can compare what different trained observers say about the same stimulus and assess their agreement. With symbolic interpretation, anything seems possible. Jung would acknowledge the difficulty, but suggests that Titchener's demand for perfect reliability is misplaced. Living systems are more variable than physical systems. Psychological patterns are probabilistic, not deterministic. The archetype does not cause a specific image, but makes certain kinds of images more likely. Interpretation is never certain, but can be more or less adequate, more or less fruitful in helping the patient understand and transform their situation. The test is not perfect agreement between observers, but therapeutic efficacy, whether the interpretation opens up new possibilities for the patient. And here they might reach an impasse, for they are judging success by different criteria. Titchener values theoretical understanding, systematic knowledge of psychological structure. Jung values practical transformation, helping individuals achieve wholeness. One serves science, the other serves healing. Both are legitimate aims, but they lead to different methods and different kinds of knowledge. Yet in the quiet of this imagined dialogue, we might sense something neither man would fully articulate, a complementarity that their opposition reveals. Consciousness does have structure, patterns of sensation and feeling that can be observed and characterized. And consciousness does generate meaning, symbolic expressions that point to deeper psychological realities. The structure makes meaning possible, provides the sensory material that becomes symbolic. The meaning organizes structure, shapes how sensations are experienced and interpreted. Consider a simple experience, the sight of a red rose. For Titchener's introspection, this becomes an analysis of red sensations of particular hue and brightness, arranged in a certain spatial pattern, accompanied perhaps by faint fragrance sensations and feelings of mild pleasantness. This is the structure of the experience, the sensory scaffolding. For Jung, the same rose might be a symbol of passion, beauty, transience. It might remind you of a first love, connect to poetry you have read, evoke archetypal associations with the rose as symbol of the soul in Sufi mysticism or of the Virgin Mary in Christian iconography. This is the meaning of the experience, the way it resonates beyond its immediate sensory presence. But these are not separate experiences. They are two aspects of one experience. The red sensation becomes a symbol of passion because of its particular sensory quality, its intensity and warmth. The symbol draws on the sensation, is rooted in it, even as it transforms it into something more than mere sensation. To study only the sensation while ignoring the meaning misses half the experience. To study only the meaning while ignoring the sensory foundation misses the other half. This suggests that a complete psychology would need both approaches, would need to understand how sensation becomes symbol, how structure generates meaning. But such a synthesis was not possible in Titchener and Jung's time, and remains difficult now. The methods are too different, the underlying assumptions too divergent. Analysis and interpretation, reduction and amplification, element and archetype, conscious surface and unconscious depth, these remain in tension, each approach illuminating what the other obscures. Perhaps the tension is necessary, generative, creative. Perhaps psychology needs this dialogue between opposite approaches, this oscillation between precision and richness, between structure and meaning. When we study consciousness only as structure, we lose the significance that makes it human. When we study psyche only as meaning, we lose the concrete grounding that makes it real. The dialogue keeps both poles alive, prevents either from becoming totalizing. In the history of psychology, Titchener's approach was largely abandoned after his death, while Jung's approach flourished and continues to influence therapy and cultural interpretation. This might suggest Jung was right and Titchener wrong, but such a judgment seems too simple. Structuralism failed not because precise observation of consciousness is impossible or worthless, but because consciousness is too variable, too influenced by context and expectation to yield the universal laws Titchener sought. His method was too rigid, his demands for purity too strict. But contemporary cognitive science, neuroscience, and experimental psychology have in some ways vindicated aspects of Titchener's program. We do seek to understand the structure of consciousness, to identify its neural correlates, to map how information is processed and represented. We use different methods than Titchener's introspection, methods involving response times and brain imaging and computational modeling. But the goal of understanding consciousness as a natural phenomenon, amenable to scientific investigation, is still very much alive. Similarly, Jung's approach has limitations that have become clearer over time. His interpretations sometimes seem arbitrary, too dependent on his vast but idiosyncratic learning, too willing to find the same patterns everywhere. His theory of archetypes remains controversial, with unclear boundaries between innate patterns and cultural learning. His therapeutic methods are not easily standardized or tested for efficacy. And yet, the core insight that psychological experience is meaningful, that symptoms and dreams and symbols express truths about the person's situation and potential, remains vital. Depth psychology, existential therapy, narrative approaches all build on foundations Jung helped establish. So perhaps we should see Titchener and Jung not as right or wrong, but as having explored different regions of the psychological landscape, each region real and important, but not constituting the whole territory. Consciousness has both a structure that can be analyzed and a meaning that must be interpreted. Self-knowledge requires both precise observation of what is actually present in experience and imaginative engagement with what that presence signifies. There is wisdom in Titchener's discipline, his insistence on carefully observing rather than quickly interpreting, his patience with precise description. We need this discipline, this refusal to leap immediately to meaning, this respect for the actual phenomenology of experience. Too much interpretation, too eager symbolization, can become a defense against actually experiencing, can substitute meaning for presence. And there is wisdom in Jung's imagination, his willingness to follow symbols wherever they lead, his trust that the psyche knows more than consciousness, his faith that images emerging from the unconscious carry valuable messages. We need this trust, this openness to deeper levels, this recognition that not everything important can be directly observed or clearly articulated. The challenge is to hold both wisdoms together, to be both disciplined and imaginative, both precise and receptive, to observe carefully what is actually present without rushing to interpret, and then to explore what might be signified, what depths might be speaking through the surface phenomena, to analyze and to amplify, to reduce and to synthesize, to work with structure and with meaning. In our own inner work, in our attempts at self-understanding, we might practice this double attention. When a strong emotion arises, we might first simply observe it, noting its physical sensations, its intensity and quality, its ebb and flow, without immediately asking what it means or where it comes from. This is Titchener's introspective discipline, adapted for personal use. Just be with the experience, attend to its actual characteristics. Then, having observed the emotion carefully, we might explore its meaning, its associations, what it connects to in our history and our current situation, what it might be trying to communicate. We might ask what symbols or images capture its quality, what stories it reminds us of, what archetypal pattern it might manifest. This is Jung's amplification method, bringing imagination and interpretation to bear on what has been carefully observed. Both movements are necessary. Observation without interpretation can become sterile, a cataloging of experiences that never deepens into understanding. Interpretation without careful observation can become untethered from reality, a proliferation of meanings that don't actually fit the experience. Together, they form a complete hermeneutic circle, moving from experience to meaning and back to experience enriched by meaning. In the deep quiet of this hour, as the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes permeable, we might sense how Titchener's laboratory and Jung's consulting room are not as far apart as they seemed. Both are spaces of heightened attention to inner experience. Both require discipline and training, though of different kinds. Both seek to make visible what is usually overlooked. The laboratory makes visible the structure ordinarily obscured by meaning. The consulting room makes visible the meaning ordinarily hidden by the distraction of daily life. Both are artificial spaces, removed from ordinary existence, designed to facilitate a kind of seeing that normal circumstances prevent. And perhaps both contain an implicit spiritual dimension, though neither man would have described it that way. There is something almost contemplative about Titchener's trained introspection, this patient attention to the bare phenomena of consciousness, this attempt to see what is actually there rather than what we expect or assume. It recalls certain forms of meditation, of mindfulness, though with a different aim. And Jung's active imagination, his dialogue with the unconscious, has clear parallels to traditional spiritual practices of visualization and inner work. His insistence that the psyche contains wisdom beyond the egos, knowledge echoes mystical traditions of surrendering to a deeper self or higher power. Both men, in their different ways, were teaching attention, teaching presence, teaching how to be with oneself in a focused and open way. This may be their deepest commonality, deeper than any methodological agreement. Both believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, that human beings have a capacity and a responsibility to study their own experience, to become conscious of consciousness itself. Titchener's tragedy was that his method proved too narrow to capture the full richness of consciousness, that his obsession with purity led to sterility. Jung's risk was opposite, that his embrace of imagination and meaning made verification impossible, that his method was too subjective to achieve scientific credibility. Between them, they mark out the territory psychology must navigate, the Scylla of reductive precision and the Charybdis of interpretive proliferation. Contemporary psychology has largely chosen to navigate around both, to study behavior and brain processes rather than consciousness itself, to avoid both introspection and interpretation in favor of objective measurement. This has produced genuine knowledge and practical applications, but it has also left something out, has created a psychology that can map neural activations and predict behavior, but cannot quite capture the felt reality of being a conscious subject, of experiencing meaning and purpose and value. Perhaps we are still waiting for a synthesis that can honor both Titchener's commitment to rigorous observation and Jung's commitment to symbolic depth. Such a synthesis would need new methods, new ways of being, both precise and meaningful, both structural and interpretive. It would need to recognize multiple levels of description, from neurons to symbols, and understand how these levels relate without reducing one to another. Some contemporary approaches hint at such possibilities. Neurophenomenology combines precise first-person description of experience with neuroscientific measurement, trying to correlate the subjective and objective in new ways. Narrative psychology takes seriously the meanings people construct while remaining grounded in actual life stories. Contemplative neuroscience studies meditation and altered states, combining introspective training with scientific methodology. But a full integration remains elusive, perhaps necessarily so. The tension between observation and interpretation, between analysis and synthesis, between element and meaning, may be permanent and productive, preventing either extreme from dominating, keeping psychology open to multiple perspectives and methods. As we drift towards sleep, as thought becomes dream and meaning dissolves into image, we might rest in this unresolved tension, might allow both Titchener's clarity and Jung's depth to coexist without demanding synthesis. The mind is both structured and meaningful, both mechanical and purposive, both analyzable and irreducible. To know oneself requires both looking carefully at what is actually present and imagining what might be signified, both precise attention and symbolic interpretation. In dreams, Titchener's elements and Jung's archetypes might meet at last, not in theoretical reconciliation, but in the lived reality of the dreaming psyche. For in dreams, sensation becomes symbol effortlessly, without method or theory. A color is simultaneously a wavelength of light and a mood. A figure is both a configuration of visual elements and a personality, a messenger from the depths. Structure and meaning are not yet separated, analysis and imagination not yet opposed. The dream knows what waking consciousness must laboriously learn, that mind is not either structure or meaning but always both, that the sensory and the symbolic interpenetrate, that consciousness cannot be understood from one perspective alone. This is perhaps what both Titchener and Jung were seeking, though from opposite directions, a way to understand mind in its fullness, honoring both its material actuality and its meaningful transcendence. If we could bring them together now, not in argument but in collaboration, what might emerge? Titchener's discipline applied to Jung's symbolic material, careful phenomenological description of active imagination. Jung's interpretive skill applied to Titchener's introspective data, asking what meanings might be hidden even in simple sensations, a back-and-forth movement between observation and interpretation, between structure and symbol, between analysis and synthesis. This remains a dream, an unrealized possibility. But perhaps in our own work, in our own attempts to understand consciousness and psyche, we can practice this double vision, can learn to look with Titchener's precision and Jung's depth, can honor both the surface and the depths, both the elements and the archetypes, both the structure we can analyze and the meaning we must imagine. For consciousness is not a problem to be solved by choosing one approach over another. It is a mystery to be lived, explored from multiple angles, approached with both rigor and reverence, both analysis and wonder. Titchener and Jung, for all their differences, both felt this wonder. Both devoted their lives to understanding the miracle of awareness, of a universe that has become conscious of itself through us. Their dialogue, though never spoken, continues in everyone who studies consciousness, who practices introspection or active imagination, who seeks both to observe experience precisely and to understand its meaning deeply. We are all inheritors of both traditions, whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. We analyze and we interpret. We reduce and we amplify. We attend to structure and we seek meaning. And perhaps in this ongoing dialogue, this oscillation between perspectives, something emerges that neither approach alone could reveal a fuller understanding of what it means to be conscious, to experience, to exist as a self-aware subject in a meaningful world. Not a final synthesis, but an ongoing conversation, a complementarity of opposites that generates ever deeper insight. Let us rest now in this complementarity, holding both visions lightly, allowing Titchener's laboratory and Jung's consulting room to fade into the background as consciousness itself fades towards sleep. The elements and the archetypes, the sensations and the symbols, the structure and the meaning, all dissolving into the fluid awareness of the hypnagogic state, that threshold where Titchener's precise observations and Jung's spontaneous images might finally meet. In that liminal space, we are neither fully conscious nor fully unconscious, neither purely rational nor purely imaginal. We are suspended between worlds, between waking clarity and dreaming depth, and perhaps here, in this fertile borderland, the dialogue between analysis and interpretation, between reduction and amplification, between Titchener and Jung, can continue without resolution, without victory for either side, a permanent questioning that keeps consciousness conscious of itself, aware of its own mystery. The images that arise now, as you drift towards sleep, are both sensations and symbols, both structured elements combining according to associative laws and archetypal patterns emerging from collective depths. They are Titchener's data and Jung's revelations simultaneously, neither but both, the living reality of consciousness that exceeds every theoretical framework, every methodological reduction. Let them come, these images, without analyzing or interpreting, without asking whether they are sensations or symbols, elements or archetypes. Let consciousness explore itself naturally, as it does in the freedom of the hypnagogic state, unconstrained by method or theory, simply being what it is, structured and meaningful, precise and mysterious. A natural phenomenon that generates purpose, a material process that creates spirit. This is what both Titchener and Jung sought in their different ways, this direct encounter with consciousness itself, beyond all theories and interpretations, Beyond all analyses and syntheses, they sought the source, the wellspring of awareness, the mystery of experience. And though their methods diverged absolutely, their quest was one. In dreams, we all become introspectionists and analysts, observers of our own psychic process, explorers of inner landscapes. No training is needed, no method, no theory. Consciousness dreams itself, explores itself, knows itself without effort or technique. The elements combine and recombine spontaneously. The symbols arise and transform effortlessly. We are both audience and participants, both observer and observed, consciousness contemplating consciousness in the eternal play of self-awareness. And when we wake, we will return to the division between approaches, between scientific rigor and imaginative interpretation, between Titchener's laboratory and Jung's consulting room. But perhaps we will carry with us some memory of their unity, some sense that these opposites are perspectives on a single reality, different ways of attending to the mystery that is mind. Until then, rest in the dialogue that needs no resolution, the conversation between structure and meaning, between analysis and synthesis, between precision and depth. Let Titchener's discipline and Jung's imagination both inform your descent into sleep, bringing both clarity and richness to the edge of dreams. The laboratory and the consulting room, the introspective report and the active imagination, the sensation and the symbol, the element and the archetype, all fading now into the peaceful darkness where consciousness renews itself, where the psyche rests and regenerates, preparing for tomorrow's continued exploration of the inexhaustible mystery of awareness. May you sleep well, wanderer, having journeyed through this dialogue between great minds, having held both their visions in creative tension, having felt the pull of both precision and depth, analysis and imagination, structure and meaning. May your dreams be both clear and numinous, both precisely observed and richly meaningful, both Titchener's elements and Jung's archetypes, the full spectrum of consciousness in its endless self-exploration. Good night, and may the silence now gathering speak louder than any theory or method, revealing consciousness itself beyond all our attempts to capture it in words or systems, forever exceeding our grasp while remaining intimately present as the very awareness that questions, observes, imagines, dreams, and wakes again to wonder.